Thank you so much to everyone who is tuning into the season one finale of our Education Expert Conversation series. My name is Lisa Lazare, and I am the State Director for Educators for Excellence Boston. Educators for Excellence works to ensure that the voices of classroom teachers are included in the decisions that affect the teaching profession and students. And so every month, for the rest of the school year, E3 Boston engaged in thought provoking conversations with individuals in Massachusetts who are making an impact on education or have specific insight into education systems. Through our discussions, we will illuminate what is already being done to address pressing issues in education policy and what the participant believes still needs to happen to ensure an equitable and excellent education system in the Commonwealth. Our guest this month is Natasha Ushomirsky. Natasha currently serves as the State Director for Massachusetts at the Education Trust. In this role, she builds relationships with and supports a diverse team of Massachusetts advocacy organizations and stakeholders working to increase educational opportunity and achievement among historically underserved students. Natasha has been with the Education Trust for more than a decade. She previously served as the Ed Trust National Director of Policy, where she led the development of the organization's policy agenda on issues critical to promoting equity and achievement in the K-12 system, including standards, assessments, accountability, educator quality, and funding fairness. She started her career at EdTrust as an analyst, a role in which she focused on using data to better understand the gaps in opportunity and achievement in our education system. Before joining the Education Trust, Natasha completed her master's in education policy and management at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Prior to graduate school, she worked at the ABT Associates, a research and consulting firm, where she was involved in a variety of research and analysis projects, including economic analyses of environmental regulations and market studies. She holds a bachelor's in economics and Spanish language and literature from Brandeis University. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Natasha. I've been privileged to work alongside you for a few years at this point, and one of the things I've learned about you is that you're a connector. Whether it's MEEP or in other spaces, you're really driven by a passion for bringing people together to tackle big issues in education. And so, what brings you to this work, and why are you passionate about it?
Hi, everybody. Lisa, thank you so much for inviting me to be proud a part of this broadcast. This is just really an honor to be here with all of you today. So first and foremost, I come to this work, to sort of the work of education advocacy as an immigrant, as a refugee. My family came to the United States as refugees from the former Soviet Union in the early 90s. We left the Soviet Union because of pretty rampant anti-Semitism. And so I had this experience of coming from a society where sort of families like mine were in a lot of ways marginalized, to coming here where we're part of a group that is honestly a lot more privileged, right? And so
Mhm.
I think even as I was going through my whole school experience, despite having started as an English learner and kind of having had to advocate for myself somewhat throughout my time in education, I was really aware the whole time of how different and how much easier my experience was than the experience of so many students who didn't look like me.
Mm.
And so I think that is what initially brought me into the education advocacy space. That's what sent me to grad school. That's what brought me to Ed Trust. Ed Trust is an organization that's been around for well over 20 years, and has kind of throughout its existence been squarely focused on eliminating disparities in opportunity and outcomes. And as far as our work here in Massachusetts goes, it really we started this work at the behest of local advocates. We had folks who approached Ed Trust and sort
Mhm.
of said, look, we have this reputation as a number one state kind of in education, and we know that doesn't reflect the reality for so many of our kids. And so we initially brought folks together from across the state, to really look at data and kind of really see to understand what is underneath that number one status, right? That we talk about a lot in this state. And
Mhm.
based on sort of that collective work, we published a report with our partners called Number One for Some. That was back in 2018. And at the time, as we were preparing to release the report, folks on the call said we should keep working together and we should call ourselves something. And so that's how kind of the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership got its start. And I say that because I think, one thing that has been incredibly rewarding to me in this work here in Massachusetts has been the kind of the opportunity to work with so many folks who are so deeply committed to making sure that Massachusetts lives up to its ideals. I think often, and kind of the one of the reasons I'm really passionate about the kind of that connector role and sort of see bringing people together. Is really, I think any educator can relate to this. Oftentimes, we talk about schools as being sort of an egg crate, right, where there's every
Mhm.
individual classroom, and people aren't necessarily sort of collaborating across classroom walls or learning from each other. The same thing happens in advocacy. So we essentially have folks who are doing their work in different spaces, are not necessarily able to share information, don't have the space to share information with each other or come together. And frankly, if we think about sort of the powers that be that may not want to see change in our system, keeping us all siloed works to their advantage.
Natasha, a lot of what you just said really resonated, especially about like what brought you to this space, being an immigrant myself, the work of connecting others, of like being number one for some here in Massachusetts and really wanting to push that work. And even having Meet being brought together as a space where we are with advocates from across Massachusetts, which is one of the really very few but most powerful spaces I've been in here. And I really appreciate you cultivating that, and making sure that we are connected along our core values whenever we're in discussion. And on that end, like, what do you think that the role of advocacy is in creating good education policy? Who should be advocating and how should they do it?
So I'm actually going to start with your second question about the who should be advocating. And I think, I
Hmm.
often find myself speaking to different audiences in education, teachers, families, school leaders, district leaders, and so forth. My message to all of them is that you are an advocate. You are an
Mm.
advocate for your kids, right? And so we know how teachers step up to advocate for their kids all the time. Families step up to advocate for their kids all the time. Advocacy can take a wide range of forms. I think at its core in education, in the education space, at least the space that sort of I've been working in, right? I think one of the big lessons learned for us is that if we create policy in silos, be it in ivory
Mm.
towers or be it in sort of the halls of Congress or state houses or education agencies, um, we're never going to get it quite right, because at the
Mm.
end of the day, we need to understand to the best ability that we have how a particular decision or policy is going to play out on the ground. And the only way that we can do that is by speaking with our students, our families, our educators. And in a lot of ways with MEEP, what we do is we've tried to create a space where organizations that work directly with families and students and educators can come together and bring that expertise, that experience into the policy field. I think oftentimes, frankly, the policy space feels really intimidating to folks. Not everyone knows how a budget gets put together or how to read it, right? Or how a law moves through our very complicated and somewhat convoluted legislative process here in the state. So sort of demystifying that, I think, is one of the roles that we can play, and really helping by shaping the questions that we ask of our partners, and that helping them shape questions that they ask of the stakeholders they work with. We can sort of
Mhm.
bring more of that information, that on the ground information that sometimes our policymakers don't have the benefit of hearing,
Absolutely.
into the conversation. And in terms of, I think, like with anything, the advocacy strategy really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I will say one thing that we have found is that relationships are absolutely critical in this work. And so, we often talk about inside outside advocacy,
Hmm.
and that approach where on the one hand you might provide that outside pressure and sometimes even political cover for education leaders and state leaders to make hard changes, by writing op-eds, by showing up, right, by kind of physically being present and sort of, um, either in meetings or in broader gatherings, providing that kind of mobilized pressure, but at the same time being willing and able to come to the table with solutions,
Hmm.
sitting down kind of in the back rooms to figure out what is it that we should actually do, And I think that balance of doing both, doing the public facing pressure building and narrative building advocacy, at the same time being able to come to the table with I'm actually going to sit here and help you figure this out. I'm not just going to tell you what the problem is, right? I think that creates and helps foster the relationships that help us be the most effective.
Absolutely. And in hearing you say that, Natasha, it really brings me back to one of the core missions of E4E, where we felt that teachers have been subjects of change rather than agents of change. And so, really work hard to ensure that teachers and educators have a greater say in what's happening in education policy and are speaking to those really critical stakeholders. That relationship building piece is one of the most important ways to dismantle what we believe power looks like. And that really leads well right into the next space in terms of when you talk about us working in silos and dismantling that notion of just doing it alone. MEEP is working on releasing an equity agenda, which addresses several systemic inequities in school systems. And so, like, why do you think it's especially important to center equity and advocacy efforts right now?
I think it's always important to center advocacy efforts, education equity in advocacy efforts around education. I often go back to something I heard an education leader say, which is that if you start with equity and equity challenges within our system, you will uncover broader challenges within the system too, right? Equity challenges don't exist in a silo, but if you start with broader challenges, you may never get to equity. And
Mm.
oftentimes we approach education change through this sort of like a raise all boats kind of perspective. If we raise all boats, right, a rising tide will raise all boats. If we raise
Mm.
all boats, then things will get better for everybody. But if we start with a system, I'm sorry, I'm going to use my hands, right? If we start with a system that looks like this and we raise it up, we're still going to have that disparity. And sometimes,
Mm.
frankly, those disparities are going to grow in the process because the new opportunities that might come out of some of the changes that we create may be easier for folks who hold more privilege to take advantage of. Well-resourced schools, right, are much more ready to adopt new curricular changes or implement new classes and so forth. And so, what we see when we sort of offer kind of focus on making things better for everyone across the board and just raising all boats is that disparities stay the same or grow. And I think, right now in this world, kind of where we stand post pandemic, we just went through this incredibly challenging, we're still going through this incredibly
Mhm.
challenging experience. And as we talk to advocates in communities like Lawrence, Springfield, Worcester, the pandemic is not over. Boston as well, obviously.
Absolutely.
And so, even as we go through that experience with all of the disruptions of the past couple of years, we're in a place where everyone struggled, but we know that our communities that had already been subjected to disinvestment, that had already been denied opportunity in so many ways, including lots of our communities of color, our some of our gateway cities, and so forth. Right? We know that the pandemic hit harder there. We know that kids had a harder time accessing instruction there for a wide range of reasons. The levels of sort of personal contact with the virus and all of the stuff that came with that, all of the challenges for families, the loss that came with that has all been harsher there. And so as a result, it's not a surprise that all of our education disparities that were already huge, they're even bigger now. And so if we kind of continue to do our raise all boats thing, we're going to institutionalize those disparities.
Ooh.
So, in general, and especially right now, we really, really need to start in our thinking about education improvement as how do we make sure that our resources and supports and the changes that need to happen in our schools, first and foremost, that we are serving the students that have been most affected. Both over the past kind of couple of years, but where that's already kind of was layered on top of years and years of disinvestment and denial of opportunities and
Mhm.
impacts of racism and so forth.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that has been one of the more powerful ways I've heard what's happening right now described. And I really appreciated your analogy of like raising all boats still mean that this inequity is still happening, even though if we're all raising higher, which is a really powerful thing to think about because I know we're struggling with learning loss and gaps, but those things existed beforehand. And so what's happening now? And I think one of the things that sometimes really discourages me in education advocacy is people who are definitely on the same side fighting with each other over small perceived differences. Ooh,
Mhm.
rather than teaming up to take on inequitable systems. And so, have you observed this as well? And how can we move past this? How can we stop doing this?
So, yes, absolutely. I think I've observed this as well. I think the example I use often this year, because it's just been so striking, is so you just mentioned learning loss. And like maybe we're not big fans of that term. We tend to use unfinished learning at a trust. Instead, we can talk about the instructional impacts, the academic impacts of the pandemic, right? But there's been, you look on social media and there's this debate of sort of, do we talk about this or do we talk about kids' mental health and social emotional impacts? I think any educator will tell you that those two are directly interrelated, right? If a child is coming in with lots of sort of personal challenges, if they're having trouble focusing, they're going to have a real hard time learning. If a child cannot read, and is expected to do all sorts of work that is now going over their heads because they have just missed out on 2 years of instruction, right?
Mm,
That's going to affect their mental health. So, the idea that there's this dichotomy in the education conversation doesn't reflect the reality of schools, doesn't reflect the reality of instruction or of kids or educators' experience. And so I think that that's one of the sort of clear examples where we see sort of the narrative doing one thing and reality doing another. And the narrative is frankly really damaging, of sort of the fact that we need to choose between these two things and where do we
mhm,
focus. In terms of getting, so that's sort of one of the things. I think in some ways this is where kind of listening to the people closest to the work, listening to teachers, listening to families can really help us move forward and recognize the reality of where we are. Data can help us with this. One of the things, we've had the privilege of working with the Mass Inc. polling group over the past couple of
mhm,
years, to survey families. And one of the things that came out of the most recent survey that they released was essentially exactly what I said, that we see the greatest mental health concerns among families who also believe their kids are behind academically.
mm,
Correlation is not cause of causation, obviously, but the two
absolutely
things
not.
are moving together for families. And so we just need to recognize that and figure out from there, how do we proactively tackle both, sort of broad sets of challenges. In terms of kind of more broadly, as sort of divisions in the education space and so forth. First of all, I think relationships here are absolutely key. I think oftentimes, again, as part of this sort of siloing that sometimes happens and the way that we get pitted against each other, right? In the advocacy space, um, again, there are benefits to folks who don't want to see the system change and having us fight among
Mhm,
ourselves. So we need to keep that in mind.
so,
Um, Oftentimes, folks get portrayed as standing for something that they don't actually stand for.
mm,
That still happens, and it sounds very high school in a way, but, like, that is reality in the adult world too, and so relationships, literally kind of sitting face to face, getting to know people, in the space, I think is a really powerful way of really understanding the passion and the intention, that folks bring to this work, and then from there it's much easier to find common ground. The other thing that we often kind of, I think, as the more collective work we've been doing within a trust, the more we have been thinking about this as really sort of finding the 80% we can agree on.
ooh,
um, when we bring people together, I mean, not everyone, even as we think about, the folks within the organizational leaders within the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership work with different stakeholders in different parts of the state. They may have different perspectives on a particular issue, and that's okay. that perspective is grounded in their experience and in their work. Um, and absolutely, we there will be places where we disagree, but if we can focus on the 80% that we agree on, and focus on creating collective, sort of driving collective change in those spaces, I think we can get a lot further than if we really sort of focus in on the 20% that maybe we need to leave off the table.
That's really powerful in terms of how we build across lines of sameness instead of focusing across lines of differences. I really appreciated you scaling me back out because I recognize that we've been doing that for far too long, focusing on our differences when there's so much more that brings us together, especially the core values of why we care about this work and why we engage in education policy and advocacy in the first place. Natasha, I really want to thank you for the time you took to speak with us today. We spoke through a multitude of topics, talking about what it means to be a connector, to build relationships, the role of advocacy in education policy. How do we work outside of silos and start building connections? I really appreciated the conversation that we're bringing to our educators and our audience today. Is there anything else you'd like to let us know or inform us about what's going on at EdTrust and MEEP that we should be keeping our eyes on?
Oh, that is a great question. I think maybe what's best is if I circle back with you, Lisa, and share some resources coming out of EdTrust. I think for everybody, be on the lookout for some reports out of MAPE in coming months that are going to try to kind of establish and really put forth a vision for where we go from here. Again, we've had a couple of years of lots of challenges, lots of disruption. What we do now, what we do in the next year matters hugely. Um, for kids, families, and for educators. And so we're going to put some ideas out there. We would love to continue and kind of engage in conversation with you all about how to best drive change for the kids we are all here to serve.
Absolutely, Natasha. And when you share those resources, we will hyperlink it to this podcast. And so, for everyone, that's it for season one of our education expert conversations. We'll be back in the fall with another group of exciting and impactful guests. And for this month, E4E is working with hundreds of educators across Boston to get their takes on what solutions they would like to see to address the issues of student literacy. If you would like to share your thoughts on this pressing topic, reach out to me at llazare@e4e.org. And you can also keep up with all the rest of our upcoming events at e4e.org/events. I look forward to seeing you all in the fall. Thank you.